The term New Age has always been a false conceit in reference to the 1970s, or any time in the 20th century. American Christianity beheld a world of spiritual ideas during the 19th century. Across the globe, including the United States, new religions were forming around universalizing ideas of humanity. Hegel and Marx presented new revelations to explain the world and human history in competition with both science and the Bible, for the one could not quite explain the world, while the latter no longer seemed to hold all the answers. A liberal, squishy faith in mankind thus tended to depersonalize the Christ so that new ideas could have space in the body of Christ. Occultism, hypnotism, seances, fortune tellers, secret societies, fashionable drug abuse, patent medicine fraud, and humbug abounded. America was already an immigrant nation with its own frontier traditions. Whether Native American or faraway Eastern in origin, any exotic idea added pseudo-intellectual spice to bland old Christian teachings. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, known as Madame Blavatsky, the Russian-born mystic who founded Theosophy in the United States, was among the most prominent spiritual figures to emerge in this febrile period. Her impact has been far greater than a single institution, however. For example, the spirit of Blavatsky's church survives today in congressional hearings about flying saucers, because theosophists invented the alien contact story. Extraterrestrials are a revised 19th century script. In the 1993 book, No Religion Higher Than Truth, A History of the Theosophical Movement in Russia, 1875 to 1922, Maria Carlson links Blavatsky to the Silver Age of Muscovy Empire, a time when fashionable people indulged secret religious ecstasies, or radinia. Quote, every educated reader who was not a recluse had at least a nodding acquaintance with theosophy and spiritualism, Carlson writes. But there was also Rosicrucianism, Freemasonry, Martinism, and, of course, those more sensational manifestations of popular or boulevard mysticism. Tarot, somnambulism, chiromancy, phrenology, mesmerism, astrology, geomancy, and hypnotism. Proposing a synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy through a secret doctrine that was unabashedly Gnostic, Blavatsky, as well as her intellectual and spiritual heirs, sought to address a crisis of culture and consciousness in the world by blurring all the boundaries of the disciplines they pursued. Theosophy offered a free, mythical osmosis a libertine hybridization of myths. One could feel Christ in their heart and still speak to spirits. A Christian could claim inspiration from anything that seemed inspirational. From the beginning, Theosophy always had a globalizing utopian mission, a manifest destiny, one might even say. Russian theosophist Anna Kamenskaya opined that, quote, more developed Christians are beginning to see Christ more and more as an ideal toward which all mankind must strive, as a promise of that which mankind will become, and least of all, as an external Savior redeeming sins through himself. This is, of course, heresy to Christians. We now recognize this as social justice language, too, but Kamenskaya's Russian Orthodox critics identified it as Gnosticism and Neo-Buddhism. Nevertheless, it has a continuing legacy. Quote, Theosophy believed in and worked for Russia's cultural mission to the world and subscribed to the Russian idea, Carlson writes. Avowedly atheistic communism could not stamp out magical thinking and did not try. Contemporary Russia is still dissonant with Gnostic esotericism, alchemy, astrology, and pseudo-religious nationalism alongside an official state Christian tradition that rejects all of those things. Kamenskaya encountered Theosophy in India, where Englishwoman Annie Besant had become an early Indian nationalist. Besant's biography speaks to her spiritual quest, her divorce from a clergyman, her decision for atheism, her brief romance with George Bernard Shaw's Fabian socialism, then her embrace of Blavatsky, and finally, her adoption of Hinduism. Christian theosophists split with Besant when she appointed a smart young Hindu man as the new Christ, explaining that the exoteric Christ, the one whose body had been crucified, had merely been one of many divine manifestations which from age to age are made for the helping of humanity when a new impulse is needed to quicken the spiritual evolution of mankind, when a new civilization is about to dawn. End quote. This was not her only Aquarian Age heresy. She also struggled to incorporate reincarnation with free will, and never squared all the circles needed to perfect an eclectic, syncretistic global faith system. Still, Besant's theosophy inspired the formation of Hindu nationalism and exerted an impact on history far greater than its membership. Wherever theosophists encountered contradictions, they turned to hidden understandings, resolving the philosophical incompatibilities of vastly different faith traditions with mystification. In Germany, which had a well-developed modern Gnostic literature, Rudolf Steiner struggled with the concept of karma, quote, using the theosophical Gnostic concept of the identity of man and God, thus once again moving toward pantheism and away from any position acceptable to Christianity, Carlson writes. Avowedly Christian, Steiner could not make the Mahatmas of Hinduism fit inside the unique divinity of Christ. Steiner's influence on the Nazi Party, which adopted the Eastern symbol of good luck as its infamous symbol after his death, has been overstated by conspiracy historians. Hitler turned against the esoteric cults within Nazi elites after 1941, when Rudolf Hess, their champion, took a strange flight, parachuting into Scotland with 2 vials of supposed holy water from Tibet in a bizarre effort to strike an unsanctioned peace deal. The association with Nazis did not end Steiner's influence. His blend of Christian theosophy, anthroposophy survives at your local Waldorf school. Quote, this practice, diligently applied, is at first the path to a better understanding of and higher moral conduct in the physical world, the Sunbridge Institute website says. Eventually, it leads to insight into the workings of the spiritual world and heartfelt understanding of the lively interplay between the spiritual and physical worlds. This is religious language because Theosophy is a religion, though it has not built many temples lately. By the 1970s, when the Whole Earth Catalog and Aleister Crowley and Carl Jung were producing New Christians and New Pagans, Theosophy was no longer on the path to being a singular, temple-building institutional religion. It was instead an intuitional, individualized body of alternative religiosity. Everything outside the Abrahamic tradition was swept into a New Age category, but the American theosophical religious tradition, which allowed any and all spiritual traditions entry into a new, utopian, universalizing moral order, was already a century old by the Reagan presidency. Indeed, Protestant discontent with the encroachments of non-traditional religion upon the civic prerogatives of American Christianity was a powerful electoral undercurrent by 1980. George Adamski had already lived a peripatetic existence for a decade as a healer and magician preacher in the Southwest when he settled down to become an ESP coach. Quote, in the late 1920s, Adamski settled at Laguna Beach, California, Colin Bennett writes, in Looking for Orthon, the story of George Adamski, the first flying saucer contactee, and how he changed the world. Quote, here he taught a form of Oriental mystical philosophy combined with very strong Christian fundamentalist overtones. This view was based partly on the theosophical teachings of both Madame Blavatsky and Annie Besant, who was president of the Theosophical Society from 1907. This view was popularized by Rudolf Steiner, who taught a Christianized view of theosophy. End quote. No argument about his sources is possible. They are certain. During Prohibition, Adamski offered wine as a religious sacrament within the sanctuary of his Royal Order of Tibet, and won many lucrative converts to what he termed scientific Lamaism. Alcohol and Eastern esotericism were a profitable combination at the Temple of Scientific Philosophy. Quote, I was the biggest bootlegger around, Adamski complained later. If it hadn't been for that man Roosevelt, I wouldn't have had to get into this saucer crap. He claimed a tutelage in the Tibetan plateau, the roof of the world, as a boy. Despite never reaching 5th grade, his students called him Professor. Prohibition ended. Adamski's order became a mere fraternity within the Universal Progressive Christianity Church that purchased the property. He would continue associating with Unitarians and other liberal Christian churches to the end of his life. Like Blavatsky et al., Adamski was a Neoplatonist. Philosophers of this school hold that Platonic forms are angels, which they accord with Abrahamic angelology, both a cosmology and a theory of ethics. Neoplatonism had already expressed as alien contact narratives in 19th century theosophy. When she was not too busy fighting accusations of fraud, for example, Blavatsky received telepathic messages from, quote, lords of the flame who lived on Venus and wanted to guide the evolution of mankind. Adamski also located his brothers on Venus in 1952. As we now know, the actual planet Venus is inhospitable to life. Neither Blavatsky nor Adamski knew that, however. Nobody knew anything about Venus until Mariner 2 flew past the planet in 1962, reporting a surface so hot with such a high-pressure atmosphere that no human could survive for an instant. Contemporary scientific cosmology understands the universe as almost entirely inimical to life this way. Ancient Gnostic cosmology anticipates this reality to a degree. Earth, the moon, the 5 other planets visible to the naked eye, as well as the 12 zodiac signs, are all associated with powerful beings, subordinate to the deity responsible for creation, called Archons. The hypostasis of the Archons, for example, acknowledges that almost all the Archons in the universe are utterly opposed to human life, and expresses a keen interest in understanding just how such beings came to exist at all. Still, the difference between scientific and Gnostic cosmology is that the former tends to produce bleak views on the habitability of the universe, where the older way of thinking has always been more optimistic that other worlds have living beings on them. Theosophy organized all these heavenly beings into a spiritual hierarchy of masters. Melton J. Gordon notes in his 2001 Encyclopedia of Occultism and Parapsychology. During the 1950s and into the 1970s, Adamski and other theosophists transformed themselves into alien contactees who, quote, would speak of their contacts as being members of a space or interstellar hierarchy, end quote, exactly as the theosophists had supposedly contacted these masters. Quote, that hierarchy would, strangely enough, often be inhabited by beings who had the same names as the ascended masters originally mentioned by Blavatsky or Guy W. Ballard, another prominent interwar theosophist. Aliens were the new Archons. Adamski called these beings cosmic brothers. He described Orthon, the first brother he met, as, quote, a human being from another world, appearing round-faced with an extremely high forehead, large but calm gray-green eyes, slightly aslant at the outer corners, with slightly higher cheekbones than an Occidental, but not so high as an Indian or an Oriental. A finely chiseled nose, not conspicuously large, and an average-size mouth with beautiful white teeth that shone when he smiled or spoke. To Adamski, quote, the beauty of his form surpassed anything I had ever seen, with long tapering fingers like the beautiful hands of an artistic woman. In fact, in different clothing, he could easily have passed for an unusually beautiful woman, with his beautiful waves of hair, quote, glistening more beautifully than any woman's. Beautiful as they were, and androgynous like angels, Venusians were nevertheless human in physical form. Their more significant otherworldliness was an uncanny spiritual power. Adamski, quote, felt like a little child in the presence of one with great wisdom and much love, and I became very humble in myself. For Orthon was, quote, radiating a feeling of infinite understanding and kindness with supreme humility. Orthon indicated that he was from Venus, then repeated the Earthman word after Adamski. Communicating by hand signals and telepathy at first, Orthon was quite lucky to meet an Earthman who had taught mind reading by mail order for 3 decades. Orthon was a very fast learner, too, as future encounters took place shortly thereafter in English, which Orthon now spoke, quote, with only the slightest trace of an accent. The Cosmic Brothers knew all about Adamski. They had been carefully watching him during his formative years as a wandering teacher. They called Adamski a prodigal son, per the Christian parable, and praised his spiritual teaching. They wanted him to share a universal law and cosmic moral paradigm that would unite all mankind. What a coincidence that this message was exactly like the teachings in his 1936 book, Wisdom of the Masters of the Far East. Adamski had preached this same gospel on his KFOX Order of Tibet radio show, which began that year and ran until 1938. Now his theological principles had the endorsement of higher beings. Presumably, they were regular show listeners. Adamski had brought that world-uniting mission with him when he resettled on the side of Mount Palomar, below the famous observatory, with his acolyte Alice K. Wells and a 6-inch telescope in 1940. Adamski did not mind hard work, whatever his faults as a prophet, and they established a successful farming cooperative and a restaurant on property she owned. Wartime was difficult, but the peace brought new opportunities, as well as new seekers of wisdom. Adamski was with them when he witnessed, quote, a gigantic spacecraft that was hovering over the mountain range one day in 1946, many months before the great first wave of UFO sightings began during 1947. A radio station reported the sighting. Flying saucers were hot, Theosophy was not. Bennett notes that, quote, in the 1950s, interest in occult philosophy, fringe religion, and metaphysics in general was perhaps at its lowest ebb in European history due to the decline of 19th century spiritualism and the public perception of the behavior of Aleister Crowley, as well as the public association of esoteric spirituality with the Nazis. Yet when Irish aristocrat Desmond Leslie published Flying Saucers Have Landed, the first book which included Adamski's description of his contact with Orthon in 1953, the British public could not get enough of it, and the bibliography, quote, sent book hunters in droves, end quote, to find theosophical texts that were long out of print. The book had a similar effect in the United States when it was published the next year. I don't know what has happened, George, Leslie wrote to Adamski shortly after their book became a runaway bestseller. But all the mediums have disposed of their Indian guides, etc., and have replaced them with space people traveling in Vimanas, the chariots of the Hindu gods. Ancient ideas had been appropriated within Theosophy. Those amalgamated ideas had been refashioned for the 19th century and become passé. Now, they were rehabilitated for the age of the atom. Adamski was already adding greater diversity to the solar system. Published in 1955, Inside the Spaceships reported on extensive contacts with Martians and Saturnians, all of whom bore names straight out of Theosophy. Ramu, Furkan, Ilmuth, Kalna, Adamski's chapters of Flying Saucers Have Landed invoke Vedic religion and Tibetan traditions. Leslie applies a glossy layer of pseudoscience. The book is a curious merger of their two very different writing styles that, quote, took from an outdated context what some saw as traditional fairy stories and placed them centrally in fighter cockpits and returns from aerial radar, Bennett writes. But they were doing a species of scientism, or faith in science rather than any actual science. By linking human history to humanity's future in outer space, and mystifying Archon-like entities anew into sciency, wyancy, extraterrestrial beings, Flying Saucers Have Landed profoundly influenced the succeeding generations of ancient astronaut writers, such as Erich von Däniken, author of Chariots of the Gods in 1968. Put simply, Adamski and Leslie are the reason why the History Channel has a show about ancient aliens. It is theosophical religious programming. You're being proselyted. Overtly postmodern, Bennett is dismissive of skepticism and objectivity, which he calls genocidal. Disbelief in the Archon aliens is actual murder of the Venusians and Martians and Saturnians and their cultures, one supposes. The result is a terribly strained effort to rationalize discrepancies everywhere. For example, in Adamski's various tellings of his encounter, and maintain faith that some truth lies at the center of Adamski's ridiculous hoaxes. Bennett argues that any alien entity able to visit our planet would necessarily be so advanced that we humans would be helpless to understand what it said and showed us. Adamski was just like the stone tool wielding Pacific Islanders watching airplanes land to unload their cargo during World War II, Bennett argues. Appropriately enough, Adamski set his contact scene under a sky filled with buzzing Air Force planes. The circling patterns he describes are consistent with pilots practicing partial landings and takeoffs, the training technique known as the touch-and-go landing. Ignorant Earth Islanders, neither Adamski nor his witnesses understood what they were seeing. As a result, generations of ufologists, including Bennett, have maintained the government must have known about the encounter with Orthon. Indeed, the Air Force may even have stage managed it because there were so many planes in the sky that day. Helpfully, all the witnesses to those events signed affidavits. But only Adamski actually saw, met, and communicated with Orthon. Bennett argues that we should not be skeptical, though, because of all the fake news wars, such as Vietnam and the supposed mysteries of assassinated presidents. Adamski was a huckster, to be sure, but Bennett's more important interest is, quote, the military-industrial mythological complex, which assuredly hides the truth from us. The aliens may just be cosmic trolling by entities so advanced they have forgotten what reality even is. We cannot solve mysteries, we can only manage them, Bennett argues. He labels Adamski's encounter with Orthon, quote, pure Carlos Castaneda, comparing him to the cult guru who inaugurated the New Age period through academic fraud. Yet Bennett would reject, quote, the ruthlessly selective machinery of the Western mind that ultimately rubbished Adamski's stories. Bennett would have us understand the entire universe as information warfare, a battle of, quote, fuzzy perceptions. the shadows of Plato's cave. Quote, contact may indeed involve contact with a highly developed information field that has the power to change metaphor, he opines, sounding no less magical than his subject. Looking for Orthon wants to believe in aliens, and even Orthon without believing in George Adamski. This is how rival gospels end up informing the same religion over time, requiring scripture writers to contain the new contradictions in a single testament. When Adamski embarked on his 1959 European tour, where he was received, quote, like some magician from a dream future, he already contained contradictions. His alien interlocutors disliked rock and roll dancing. They spent a great deal of time making their own clothing, which Adamski admired in detail. His description of spaceship interiors is like, quote, a dollhouse of early consumer expectancies. Indeed, Bennett calls it a camp ship, in which eroticism has become part of the furnishings and attire. Adamski was both married to a woman who hated flying saucers, and also split the early Palomar cult over his attraction to a younger man. Bennett supposes he was homosexual or bisexual, and that this explains why all the aliens that Adamski met, both male and female, were all so very, very beautiful. In Adamski's telling, this new set of ludicrous encounters would begin at a Los Angeles hotel where he met the aliens for dinner. Then they drove him out into the desert in a black four-door Pontiac to where he embarked in a spaceship. While these visitations include exciting scenes of wonder, such as fields of crops growing on the dark side of the moon facing away from Earth, Adamski's interviews with high-level aliens, all of whom are male, devolve into boring speeches filled with dime store theosophy. The dialogue is all very much one way, Bennett complains. Adamski himself is never asked a question. His hosts conceal all curiosity of Earth, and he himself does not find the platitudinous condescension at all offensive. Rather than a futuristic take, the scenes have an early mall quality, with the sets dressed in big and clumsy equipment that is far too crudely electromechanical. Adamski was an old world man in a new, changing world. Returning from Europe, the shaman-like prankster was more pessimistic than before, and more paranoid. His newsletters now told of a silence group holding, quote, the invisible reins of financial influence that extend from Zurich to puppet organizations in every nation. Going only so far as to name the Bank of Switzerland, Adamski stopped short of endorsing anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Adamski was Polish Romany, after all, so he had only missed the Holocaust himself through the accident of parental emigration. Adamski had always scoffed at psychics, too, but after 1960, it was increasingly difficult for him to fake these encounters, and he increasingly referred to his alien contacts as psychic guides instead of real beings. UFOs were physical phenomena, he had insisted, and not any sort of mass delusion. After 1959, however, his claims to extraterrestrial guidance became less and less literal. It was one source of the doctrinal disputes that would lead to the dissolution of the Adamski cult before his death in 1965. By then, George Adamski had decided that not all of the aliens were friendly or even competent. Some of them were downright demonic. At the same time, the world had become more complicated, more violent, more divided. Nevertheless, Adamski had shown the way for Theosophists across the world, and now they became contactees. When the planets of the solar system proved inhospitable to human life, Edward Billy Meyer placed his aliens' homeworlds in the Pleiades. We can discern this same evolving picture of the universe in the bizarre galactic backstory of L. Ron Hubbard, another cult guru influenced by Theosophy. Gordon writes that this broad migration of Theosophy was an explicit faith project, for the great majority of the contactees organized spiritual religious groups. Some, such as the New Age Foundation established by Wayne Aho or the Sanctuary of Thought launched by Truman Bethurum, had little success and folded soon after the death of their leader. More successful were Unarius, founded by former spiritualist mediums Ruth and Ernest Norma; the Aetherius Society, founded by British contactee George King; and the I Am Nation, founded by a group of contactees in Florida. Each of these organizations produced a large body of occult literature and have survived to the present under a second generation of leadership. Their contemporary inheritors include David Icke and John Lamb Lash. We must also add the Heaven's Gate cult, as founders Bonnie Nettles and Marshall Applewhite practiced theosophical magic. The Raelian movement also bears many hallmarks of theosophy. Paraphrasing the skeptical woman, who responded to Bertrand Russell's famous astronomy lecture, alien contact stories are theosophy all the way down. Beginning with its first literary prophet, the extraterrestrial contact story has always been one single step removed from tarot cards and parapsychology and astrology and Tibetan mysticism, because the underlying belief system to the narrative trope of meeting Orthon was theosophy all along. Colin Bennett compares the worship of flying saucer gods to the Melanesian cargo cults, a spiritual phenomenon which took place at the same historical moment. However, George Adamski was a heretical Christian, so to analyze him is to embark on an endless reduction to the theosophical mean. An eclectic set of religious and magical ideas, Bennett calls it a lavish spiritual kitsch, was appropriated and syncretized during the 19th century. During the 20th century, that new religion of seances and mystic guruship reinvented itself for a future in the post-war world that was becoming a Cold War world. It is still with us in the 21st century. One might even suggest it has triumphed. Like any self-respecting religion, the extraterrestrialized theosophy has its own dubious story of human origins and destiny, as well as a prophetic tradition of the future of humanity. Theosophists say this complements the biblical story, but UFO cults also exist in tension with fervent Christian devotion, and sometimes the theosophical lines of belief become impossible to ignore. During 1991, for example, televangelist Jack Van Impe expressed optimism that flying saucers were in fact chariots of the angels, and he suggested this heavenly host was practicing for the rapture. His imagery recalled the bombers in the sky over Adamski and Orthon, circling again and again to make touch-and-go landings, practicing for Judgment Day. Just months after he said that on his TV show, however, Van Impe's newsletter announced that flying saucers were likely demons summoned by satanic New Age forces. A Christian prophet had discovered the Theosophy in UFO prophecy, and he was not pleased.